Dear students, welcome back to school and welcome to this series of videos produced by the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Anatomy, University of Khartoum. This is Wathir Al-Fatih Idris, a teacher assistant of anatomy, basic medical sciences department at the Faculty of Dentistry, University of Khartoum. Today we'll start studying the anatomy of the thoracic part of the body. We'll start with talking about the osteology of the thoracic cage, talking about the sternum, the vertebrae, and classify them into typical and atypical ones, as well as the ribs, and they will also be classified into typical and atypical ones. And later we'll discuss the articulated thoracic cage, and we'll know about the true and false ribs. So let's start. This is the sternum. Okay, the sternum is composed of three parts. The uppermost part here is known as the manubrium. The middle portion is the largest, and this is known as the body of the sternum. And the lowermost portion, this is a small projection, and is known as the xiphisternum. So it's composed of a manubrium, sterni, the body, and xiphisternum. Okay, starting talking about the manubrium. The manubrium is a flat four-sided bone whose upper border is excavated into a concavity. This is known as the jugular notch or the suprasternal notch that houses the interclavicular ligament. The superolateral angle is also excavated into two concavities on either side. This is for the articulation for the atypical synovial joint that it makes with the sternal end of the clavicle. The side of the manubrium at the upper portion shows a concavity for articulation with the first costal cartilage, and near its lower end it shows another cavity, and this concavity for articulation with the upper part of the second costal cartilage. Okay, below its lower border articulates with the body of the sternum at a secondary cartilaginous joint. This is known as the manubrio-sternar junction that is projecting forward, and is also known as the sternal angle of Louis, a very important landmark in the thorax. Okay, talking about the sternum, as you can see, the body of the sternum is also flattened, and it bears on its lateral border a series of concavities for the third through the seven ribs, costal cartilages. Okay, and the upper portion, the lateral side of the body of the sternum, shows a small concavity for the lower portion of the second costal cartilage. Okay, the inferior border of the sternum articulates with the xiphisternum at the xiphisternal junction, and this is known as a symphysis or another secondary cartilaginous joint. That's all for the sternum. Certain characteristic features are typical for the middle of this series of the ribs, and these assign the ribs as typical ones, while those that are lacking a single feature or have got an additional feature are assigned as atypical ribs. Starting talking about the typical ribs, typical ribs has got, each of them has got a head, a neck, and a shaft. Okay, the head of the rib of a typical rib is beveled by the presence of two articular facets. The facets are smooth surfaced areas that are covered in life with hyaline cartilage, and they provide articulation for other bones. These two facets slope away from a dividing ridge in between, and the inferior one is almost vertical. It provides articulation for the superior demifacet on the side of the body, the corresponding vertebra, while the superior one here it faces upwards, and this provides articulation for the inferior demifacet on the side of the body of the vertebra above. Okay, each of these two facets makes a single synovial joint with a single cavity, a separate cavity. These two cavities are separated from each other by a ligament that passes to be attached to the ridge on the head of the rib. The head then passes forwards into an expanded portion, and this is the neck. The expanded neck slopes upwards into a sharp upper border into a thin prominent upper border. This is known as the crest or the cristy colline costi. Okay. At the end of the neck, there is a bony prominence. Here is the bony prominence, and this is known as the tubercle of the rib. Each tubercle, each typical rib shows two facets. Okay, and the medial and lateral facet. This is the medial one, and this is the lateral one on the tubercle of the rib. The medial one is smooth, is covered in life with hyaline cartilage, and this articulates with the costal facet on the transverse process of the corresponding thoracic vertebra, while the lateral one is rough, and this provides attachment for the lateral costal transverse ligament. From the tubercle, the shaft then slopes downward and forward and laterally into an angle. Okay, this is the angle of the rib, and from the angle, the shaft then curves forward. The shaft has got an upper border that is blunt in outline, as you can see here, while the inferior border is sharp. The inferior border of the rib is sharp, and beyond the angle, it's projected downward into a very thin and sharp ridge that houses the subcostal groove. Okay, this is the subcostal groove which lodges the intercostal neurovascular bundle. More anteriorly, this inferior border becomes blunt again like the superior one. The anterior extremity of the rib, as you can see here, is concave. Okay, and this concavity shows cancellous bone into which plugged the costal cartilage of the rib. Okay, that's all for the ribs. As I have previously mentioned, that each of those ribs that have got a missing feature of the characteristic features of typical ribs, or an additional feature is assigned as an atypical ribs. The atypical ribs are the first, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th ribs. Okay, we'll start talking about the first rib. As you can see here, the first rib is the most curved, the broadest, the flattest, and the thickest of the series. It's composed of a head that projects upwards and backwards into a neck, and it has got a shaft. It looks like somewhat being reversed, so that in a state of having superior and inferior borders, as in typical ribs. As you can see here, this is the superior and the inferior borders. Now it has a superior and inferior surface, and in a state of having an inner and outer surface, it possesses an internal and external borders. Okay. Talking about the rib, in order to differentiate the first rib, whether it's right and left, we have to place it in a flattened plane, so that we'll find that in the anatomical position, the head and the anterior extremity both touch the plane, while when tilted upwards and downwards, we will find that the neck and the head are projecting off the table, so this will enable us to differentiate between right and left sides. Okay, so in the anatomical position, both the head and the anterior extremities touch the plane, so that this would be a right-sided first rib. Talking about the head is small, and it is a single articular facet for articulation with the single facet on the side of the body of the first thoracic vertebra and near its upper border. Okay, the head then slopes backward and upward into a flattened neck that shows at its end a backward tubercle. The tubercle in the first rib is the most superior, it is the highest, and it's the most posterior structure. Okay, and the neck, this tubercle represents the fused true tubercle of the rib and the angle of the shaft. Okay, it shows also a medial and lateral facets. The medial is smooth for the transverse process of the first thoracic vertebra, and the lateral one gives attachment for the first lateral costal transverse ligament. Okay, And we have got the shaft at the most lateral convexity of the shaft. Here, the superior surface shows a groove. This is known as the subclavian groove. As you can see, this is the subclavian groove. And this groove lodges the subclavian artery as well as the lower trunk of the brachial plexus below and behind the artery. Okay? Just in front of this subclavian groove, the internal border of the bone shows a bony projection, a small spur. This is known as the scalene tubercle that extends into a triangular ridge on the superior surface of the bone. And this scalene tubercle gives attachment to scalenus anterior muscle. Okay, in front of the scalene tubercle, there is another groove here in the bone, and this groove is for the subclavian vein. It's also known as the subclavian groove. Okay, the anterior extremity of the bone is also excavated into a shallow concavity that provides an articulation for the first costal cartilage. The superior surface behind the subclavian groove for the subclavian artery is quadrangular in outline, and this gives insertion for the scalenus medius muscle, while anteriorly here at the costal chondral junction, the superior surface of the junction gives origin to the subclavius muscle. Now, talking about the 10th rib, this is the 10th rib. The 10th rib can be regarded as atypical except for its head, as it bears a single facet. This facet is covered with hyaline cartilage layer for articulation with the side of the body of the 10th thoracic vertebra. Otherwise, it has got a typical neck, a tubercle, an angle, as well as a shaft. And anteriorly, it shows a concavity for the 10th costal cartilage. Okay. Now talking about the 11th rib, as you can see, the 11th rib is short. It's composed of a small head. The head bears a single articular facet that is covered also with hyaline cartilage for articulation with the single costal facet located on the side of the body of the 11th rib. Then it is constricted into a short neck that leads to the shaft directly, and there is no tubercle. Okay, the shaft, as you can see here, is short. It has got a brown superior border and somewhat inferior sharp border that shows a costal groove. Okay, here this is the costal groove for the 11th rib, and anteriorly it provides articulation for the 11th costal cartilage. So it has got a head, a neck. There is no tubercle. There is a faint angle and a shallow costal groove. The 12th rib is similar to the 11th rib, except that its shaft is very short. It has got a small head for carrying a single facet for articulation with the costal facet on the side of the body of the 12th thoracic vertebra, a short constricted neck that leads imperceptibly into the shaft. It has got no tubercle and has got no angle, and there is no costal facet. Moreover, that the internal surface of the bone faces somewhat superiorly rather than directly inwards. That's all for the atypical ribs. Now, moving to talk about the thoracic vertebra. Each thoracic vertebra is composed of a ventral body, as you can see here, and a dorsal neural arch. Three processes diverge from the neural arch. In the midline posteriorly is the spinous process. On either side, laterally and backwards, are the transverse processes of the vertebrae. Okay. Between the transverse process and the spinous process, this portion of the neural arch is known as the lamina, and the portion that lies between the transverse process and the body of the vertebra is known as the pedicle. Okay, at the junction of the pedicle and the lamina are superior here and inferior articular. Okay, these are the inferior processes that bear articular facets hiding quartic surfaces of bones that provide articulation between adjacent and successive neural arches. Between the body and the neural arch is the spinal foramen or the vertebral foramen. The successive vertebral foramina of the whole series of the vertebrae form the spinal canal or the vertebral canal that locks the spinal nerve or the spinal cord. Okay, so now talking about the body. The body of each typical thoracic vertebra is heart-shaped, and the spinal canal is circular in outline, unlike other parts of the vertebral column. The superior articular processes and the inferior articular processes project from the junction of the pedicles and the lamina, that is to say at the root of the transverse process. The superior articular processes bear superior articular facets that face backward towards the spinous process and somewhat laterally, while the inferior processes bear articular facets that face somewhat medially and forward. They face forward towards the body, which lies ventrally, and somewhat medially, so both articular facets lie in the arc of a circle, provide some sort of rotation at the thoracic part of the vertebral column. Okay. Looking at the side of the body, we have got يمكن نعيده. معلش
طيب ما مشكلة
أواصل كيف؟
أصل
في نفس الفيديو من غير ما تنسى ده؟
أي
شور؟ والله أحسن تنسى.
حاول تسجل لي نفس الصوت تروح أقطع في النص وأروح أواصل. فهمتي؟
ما فهمتك.
ما تستخدمي. واصل. يلا بعدين نشوف.
طيب هسه نحن كذا كويسين صح؟ طيب. Now moving to talk about the thoracic vertebrae. The typical thoracic vertebrae or each thoracic vertebra is composed of a ventral body and a dorsal neural arch. Okay, three processes diverge from the neural arch. These are in the midline, the spinous process dorsally, and posterolaterally on other sides are the transverse processes. The part of the neural arch that lies between the transverse process and the spinous process is known as the lamina. Okay, this is the lamina, and that part that lies between the transverse process and the body of the vertebra is known as the pedicle of the vertebra. So this is the pedicle of the vertebra. At the junction of the pedicle and the lamina, that is to say at the root of the transverse process, are superior articular processes and inferior processes. Okay, the superior, these are the superior, and these are the inferior articular processes. Okay. The body is heart-shaped together with the neural arch, encloses the spinal foramen or the vertebral foramen. The series of this vertebral foramina or the spinal foramina of the whole vertebral column produces the spinal canal or the vertebral canal that lodges the spinal cord. The body is heart-shaped in outline, both superiorly and inferiorly, and it's concave from above downwards, as well as posteriorly it is concave from side to side. Okay, the side of the body of a typical thoracic vertebra shows a pair of demi-facets. Demi means half, and facet is a smooth surface area that is covered with hyaline cartilage and provides articulation. This is the superior demi-facet, is located on the top of the side of the body, close to the superior margin, while the inferior one is much smaller, and it faces downwards. the superior demifacet provide articulation for the inferior facet located at the head of the rib, while the inferior one provides articulation for the superior demifacet on the head of the corresponding rib. Okay. Now moving to talk about the neural arch. On the transverse process in the anterior surface towards the tip, there is another concavity. This is known as the costal facet. This costal facet is covered in live also with hyaline cartilage and provides articulation for the medial facet of the tubercle of the corresponding rib. The superior processes shows a superior articular facets. Those facets face backwards towards the spinous processes and somewhat laterally. Those of both sides lie in the arc of a circle, so they provide some sort of rotational movement that is in the thoracic vertebrae that is limited by the articulating fact of the ribs. While the inferior articular facets, as you can see here, face forward towards the body. So they face forwards and somewhat medially, both lying in the arc of a circle here, allowing for the rotational movement between the vertebrae, successive vertebrae. Atypical vertebrae are the first, the 10th, 11th, and the 12th vertebrae. The 10th, 11th, this is the 10th, 11th, and the 12th vertebrae all have got a feature that is common to them. This is that they have got at the side of the body a single complete articular facet. Okay, this is the 10th, and here also a single facet, and on the 12th vertebra also a single facet on the side of the body. In order to differentiate between the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th rib is first to look at the transverse process near the tip. If the transverse process, so you can see here, contains or is a costal facet, then this should be assigned as a 10th rib. So the 10th as a 10th vertebra. So the 10th vertebra, there's a single complete facet on the side of the body near the superior border of the vertebra, of the body of the vertebra, and also it bears a costal facet on the anterior surface of the transverse process near the tip. Otherwise, it's a typical vertebra. It has got superior articular and inferior articular facets. The superior one face backward and laterally, while the inferior ones face forward and somewhat medially. Okay. Now we have eliminated the 10th vertebra. In order to differentiate between the 11th and the 12th vertebra is to look at the inferior articular processes. If the inferior articular processes face forward and medially, as in this case, then the vertebra is an 11th one. If the inferior articular facets face directly lateral, as in this case, then this is the 12th rib. The inferior articular facets are similar to those of lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so in order to differentiate again between the 10th, 11th, and the 12th vertebra is to first look at the side at the transverse process. If it contains a costal facet, then this is a 10th vertebra. Now we'll be with the 11th and the 12th vertebrae. In order to differentiate between them, we have to look at the inferior articular facets. If the inferior articular facets face forward and medially, then this is an 11th vertebra. If it faces directly lateral, like those of lumbar vertebrae, then this is the 12th vertebra. Moreover, the transverse process shows a rounded eminence of bone just behind the superior articular facet. This is known as the mammillary body, and inferiorly it shows a sharp projection this sharp projection is known as the accessory tubercle. So the 12th thoracic vertebra shows a single complete facet at the side of the body. It has got no costal facet on the transverse process. Instead, it has got superiorly a mammillary body, while inferiorly it has got an accessory tubercle and the inferior articular facets in a state of facing forward, and medially, like other thoracic vertebrae, it faces directly lateral like the lumbar vertebrae. The 4th atypical vertebra is the first vertebra. This is a typical one. However, the first vertebra differs than the rest of the typical thoracic vertebrae in that it has got a broad body that is not heart-shaped. The second feature is that on the side of the body it bears two facets. The superior one is a complete facet for articulation with the single facet located on the head of the first rib, while the inferior one is a demi-facet for articulation with the superior facet on the head of the second rib. The third feature is that the superior border of the pedicle does not lie level with the upper margin of the body of the vertebra. It lies somewhat low down, so that the body of the first thoracic vertebra participates in the formation of the intervertebral foramen both above and below for the transmission of the 8th cervical spinal nerve and the first thoracic spinal nerve. So that's all for atypical thoracic vertebrae. Now we'll be able to appreciate the articulated thoracic cage. Anteriorly here we were able to see the sternum with its all three parts, and posteriorly we have got the articulated thoracic vertebrae. In between them are articulated the ribs. Okay, each rib terminates anteriorly in a costal cartilage. The articulation is known as the costochondral, junction, and this is a primary cartilaginous joint. The costal cartilage is no more than the anossified anterior part of the rib. The first costal cartilage is thick and short. It's exceptional in that it articulates with the side of the manubrium, the upper part of the side of the manubrium, in a primary cartilaginous joint, unlike the others which articulate with the side of the sternum in a synovial joint. So there is very little movement at this joint, and the rib, the first rib as well as the manubrium, move together as a single unit. This provides a stability to the clavicle as well as to the upper limb. Okay. The second, third, fourth, sixth, seventh costal cartilage articulate with the side of the body of the vertebra in a synovial joint, with the side of the body of the sternum in a synovial joint. Each has got a single cavity, with an exception for the first costal cartilage, which articulates opposite the sternal angle of fluid. The upper and the lower parts are separated in separate synovial joints. Okay. These costal cartilage extending from the first terminal through the seventh one that gain attachment to the sternum are known as true ribs, while those of the 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs articulate with each other by means of synovial joints, and they articulate with that of the 7th rib by means of another synovial joint, and together they form the costal margin. Okay. Posteriorly here we can appreciate the articulation of the transverse processes with the tubercles of the ribs in the costotransverse joints, which are also synovial joints, while more anteriorly the heads of the ribs articulate with the sides of the bodies of the vertebrae in another synovial joints. The 11th and the 12th ribs have got no anterior attachment. They are attached only posteriorly, and they have got no anterior attachment to the sternum or to the aforementioned costal cartilage, and these are known as floating ribs.